guys, welcome back to my channel. Now in this tutorial, I'm going to show you a really special cake technique that's been around for a couple of years and took me a while to figure out how to do it, but I did it and I love it. And it's the concrete cake. At first I thought it was all about putting different shades of grey onto a cake and just scraping it, but it is more than that. It's all about how the buttercream reacts and how temperatures change throughout the process, and it's really exciting and the effect is really amazing, and so I'm going to show you exactly how to do it. To start, I've got a 6-inch crumb-coated cake like I usually do, but of course this works on any size cake. But what's important is the buttercream that goes on the second coating. So in this bowl, I have some white Swiss meringue buttercream, and I've also kept a little to the side. This is to go on after I do the concrete cake because I want to add some colour, so I'm not going to be using this just yet. And of course we want the concrete colour first, so I want to be colouring this grey. So here I've got some black gel food colouring, and into the buttercream I'm going to add a couple of drops. Now you actually want the shade of this grey quite light, and then the darker shades of the grey will come after, which you'll see in a bit. So I'm just going to mix in the colour until it's fully combined in the buttercream. And of course I'm using a gel food colour. The gel colours mix in better, they don't change the consistency as much. Now that's quite a light shade of grey. I do want to go in a little bit darker, so I'm going to go in with a couple more drops. And the amount of colour will obviously depend on how much buttercream you're colouring. But like I said, you do want to stay on the lighter shade of grey. There, so that's a really nice light shade of grey, and in fact I would call this stone colour, which obviously helps. Now I know you're thinking, and you've probably seen concrete cakes that have really dark patches. Again, don't worry, that comes later, and it is still from this exact batch of buttercream, so you don't need to add too much colour at this point. So I've got my coloured buttercream, so now I'm going to fill up a piping bag, and the piping bag is just going to help me apply the second coat of buttercream. And cut just a small hole in the end. And now I can pipe this buttercream all the way up the cake. So I like starting at the very bottom where the cake is touching the cake board and get a nice thick layer on, and then start to work my way up the cake. So I do push quite a lot with my right hand, the one that's holding the piping bag, because I do want a nice thick layer on there, because we will be scraping this cake quite a lot. And I think using a piping bag when going on with your second coat of buttercream is a lot quicker, and you're guaranteed more of an even layer around the outside of the cake. So I'm going to pipe all the way to the top of the cake and fill in any gaps. So small gaps are fine, but larger ones I can just fill in. And then I like to pipe a ring around the very top of the cake to really pack in those corners, and then fill in the middle. So now I've got my buttercream on, I'm going to flatten out the top using my step palette knife, just with the one side of the palette knife placed onto the top of the cake, and I'm going to start turning the cake to achieve that nice flat top of the cake. And I think the beauty of concrete cakes is when they're so sharp and straight, it barely actually looks like a cake, and so just across the top of the cake, I'm going to go with my scraper because I want that top extremely flat. And this just acts as a big palette knife. So across, take off the excess. Naturally, we mound the middle on the top of the cake, so this just makes it super, super flat. And I'm just letting the weight of the scraper glide across the top of the cake. And now the top's flat, I can go around the sides with my scraper. So keeping the scraper straight as possible, turning the cake, and at first going on with quite a light pressure, and then slowly pressing into the cake and smoothing out that buttercream. And I always find that when I pipe on the outside layer of buttercream, the gaps close quickly and it gets smooth pretty fast. So I think already without this added shading and texture, it looks kind of like a solid lump of concrete already because of the grey colour. But we're only halfway. So I'm just going over the buttercream a couple more times just to get a really smooth finish and get rid of any lines. But this is going to be going in the freezer, and we are going to be doing more scraping. So if this is not perfect, it's fine because we're going over it again. So even if there is a couple of air bubbles, I'm not going to worry because I'm going over with the scraper again after it's been chilled. So it really doesn't have to be perfect. So I'm pretty happy with this. It's nice and straight and it's all one color. Now this is the magic part. This goes into the freezer. Now you do have to have a freezer for this, otherwise the effect won't work as well. If you don't have space in your freezer for a cake this big, then make room in your fridge and just set the fridge to the lowest temperature possible and leave it in there for a long time until this is super, super cold. You'll see why in the next stage, but what I am going to do is leave this corner like this, where the buttercream is still rough. Because it's going in the freezer to get nice and cold, I can cut this nice and sharp afterwards. So I'm going to put this in the freezer for at least 20 minutes to half an hour. Okay, so this buttercream is super, super solid. It's been in the freezer for quite some time, and I can tell because when I press it, nothing comes on my fingers, and I can feel that it's really cold. So while it's still cold, now I want to work quickly because I don't want this buttercream getting soft. Firstly, I'm going to chop off these corners of buttercream using a sharp knife so I can get some really nice sharp corners. So I'm just running the sharp knife around the top of the cake, and you can see that the buttercream just comes off as one. You can quite literally pick it up, and I'm going to put it back in that grey buttercream bowl because eventually it will soften and I can use it if I need it. If you do have a big build-up of buttercream on the top where the corners are, just make sure you cut it quite gradually, because otherwise you are at risk of breaking big chunks of the buttercream off. And I can already see where I'm cutting and dragging the knife, some different shading is happening, which gives a clue what happens when I start going around with the scraper and how to achieve the concrete effect. Now it's time for the magic. I'm going to get my scraper again, and I'm going to start scraping the cake. Now, even though it's really smooth and straight, this is how you get that shading. Because the buttercream is cold, it sort of reacts when you move it around like this. So I'm going to put the scraper back onto the buttercream and press kind of firm against it. I can because it's cold, and just start scraping. And at first, it doesn't look like much is going on. Then you start to see something happening. And it's only a very small amount coming off of my scraper because obviously the buttercream has set. But the more you go around and the more you scrape, the more shades of grey start to appear, especially the darker shades, which is why I started with a lighter shade of grey. So very quickly, this really cool shading starts to happen. And it's one of those things that you have to know when to stop. So firstly, you don't want to go too far, because you still want some of these lighter shades of grey on the cake, as well as the dark ones. But also, if you scrape and scrape and scrape, the buttercream will start to soften and therefore lose this concrete effect. So you do need to work quickly and work on the cold cake until you're happy with it. And I think I'm nearly there. And it's subtle, but really, really effective. And I think I'm happy with the sides. What I'm going to do is just tidy up the very top, because every time you go around with your scraper, you push buttercream upwards. But for this, I can use my palette knife like I usually would. And I'll still get those sharp corners because the cake's still cold. So I'm just going from the outside in and scraping every time just to clean off those top corners. And cleaning off the corners causes the shading on the top of the cake as well. There, I think it looks really cool. So this is going to go back in the freezer because I'm going to add some coloured buttercream on top, and I want to build up even more texture on top of it. You can, of course, leave it how it is, but there is just something that I wanted to say, is that certain black food colourings come out differently, and this is a slightly purple shade, for example. Black is extremely difficult to achieve, so try and get the best quality gel food colouring you can. I've obviously got my link on my Amazon shop in the comments box, but if yours looks a little bit purple, then you can balance the black with a little bit of yellow. Or some blacks look actually a bit green, so just kind of avoid those ones. But they may not be 100% pure grey, so just watch out what black colour you're using. I'm just going to pop this back in the freezer for 5-10 minutes just to firm up again, and then finish off with the textured buttercream. So like I said, I've had this setting in the freezer for another 5 minutes, and now it's firmed up again. Also, a good tip is that if you're not happy with the concrete effect when you're scraping it and you can feel that the buttercream's getting too soft, pop it back in the freezer and just carry on 10 minutes after. But what I'm going to do is add on a little bit of colour and more texture using buttercream. So what I did is colour my extra bit of white buttercream 2 shades of turquoise, and I've also got prepared an Isomalt sail, and I have a whole tutorial on how to work with Isomalt, so head to my channel and check that out if you haven't already. So for the texture, what I'm actually going to do is start off with the lighter shade of turquoise, and you really don't need a lot of buttercream for textured work, but it's better to mix in the color with like 2 tablespoons of buttercream. But with my palette knife, I'm going to take just a small amount and choose my front. To be honest, I kind of like all of this cake, and I'm just going to not think about it too much and just spread on a nice big bit of colored buttercream like this. And I'm only going to focus in one area because I don't want to hide all of the concrete effect. And I might go upwards and across. And because the cake underneath is so cold, this buttercream is going to set really quickly. So I actually may not put more onto this. I'm just going to try and spread it out a bit until I'm happy with the effect. And I'm going to just bring it up onto the top of the cake just a little bit to continue to the design, almost like paint strokes, and then a small amount of the dark. Now I actually think it works better to have the lighter base first and then smaller amounts of dark on top, but essentially you could do whatever design you want. Just going to add little touches of the darker texture. And of course, this textured technique works on any cake design, but I think it really complements the concrete cake. And then to finish, I'm just going to simply place the Isomalt sail on top by putting a little bit of buttercream just so it's secured down, but not too much because then it does show. Place on the sail. And I think that is a really cool alternative cake design. I love making these. When I get a request for it, I just love it. And this is actually one of the designs that we teach here at Baker Street, which is my studio in Tel Aviv, which I'm sure many of you have seen on Instagram. So this is how you make this design, but once you've got the concrete down, you can pretty much put any sort of decoration on. So give it a go, and if you do, of course, tag me at George's Cakes on Instagram so I can see them. I love seeing when you try new techniques out. And if you have any suggestions of other tutorials or videos that you want to see, then don't forget to place in the comments box and like and share this video too. And I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you very soon.